In this lesson, we're going to be talking about adapting course textbooks. And I suspect that most of you will be interested in doing this for the course that you're designing curriculum for. Let's try to think about ways that we could do it more effectively. The textbook starts off by cautioning teachers and curriculum designers from relying overly heavily on textbooks. So they point to a couple different theorists. Prabhu, who in 1989 was pointing out that the pre-ordered course books that schools might be interested in providing to teachers and students will often not be effective because the teaching needs to be matched to learners' current knowledge. And so no matter what group of students you have, probably every time you have a slightly different mix of skills and needs. And so if you go ahead and pre-order something ahead of time, those textbooks might not match them. Allwhite, also in the 1980s, was already pointing out that textbooks remove learners from the process of negotiating the course content. And so, for example, teachers could, on the first day, as part of assessing needs for students, they could also ask students what they'd like to learn about, how they like to learn, things that you've probably done somewhat in your needs analysis for your course. So when you have a textbook that you choose, or even if it's forced upon you, right, the learners don't have a lot of say in what's in that textbook. So that's some reasons to be concerned. However, I'm not sure that we need to take quite such a dreary perspective on textbooks. So what I'd like you to take a moment to think about is actually, what do you think is the optimal role of textbooks in a course? And this would be a great place to pause if you'd like to take a moment to think about this. Okay. Hopefully you've come to some decisions regarding what you think might be optimal. Now, what we're going to think about as we move forward is first how to choose textbooks, but also then how to adapt them once we've chosen them. Now, what we'll be focusing on, right, is thinking about ways of adapting textbooks in ways that may help address some of these concerns from Prabhu and Allwright, that course books or textbooks remove the learners and that it won't match students' current knowledge particularly well. So we're going to try to find ways to adapt whatever it is that we do choose. So the textbook talks about reasons for choosing a book, that you could follow a book. First of all, a lot of schools choose books and require instructors to use those. Now, as a curriculum designer, you might have some power to influence that choice moving forward. However, you might not. It might be chosen by a committee. It might be a deal with a book publisher. So you might not have a lot of say over the book that is chosen and required for the course. Also, teachers in particular might not have a lot of choice, individual teachers, because if there's been attempts to standardize a class across sections and time, there may be a desire to stick with a particular textbook and make sure that all of the teachers are using it so that you get the same quality and quantity of instruction in the class time. Another reason for following a textbook, especially if you've got inexperienced or untrained teachers, is that they can provide a lot of structure and guidance for how to teach. So inexperienced teachers often really appreciate having a textbook that provides, the content that they need to share with students, the practice activities, all in a structured manner that, helps scaffold students. Of course, more experienced teachers may find that restricting if they have to follow it too closely. A curriculum designer may also be interested in following a book if the teachers are convinced of the high quality of the book. So if a teacher loves a book and you rip it away, they might not thank you for that. And also another thing to consider is often we need some kind of material for teaching. Now you can buy source books, which may be a collection of readings. You can collect, of course, some of your own materials. But if students have to buy a book, they often want to cover as much of it as possible. Otherwise, they feel kind of like they've been ripped off. That they had to pay all that money for the book, and then it's not even being used. So those are some considerations. So assuming that maybe we want to use a good textbook, there are systematic ways that we can go about choosing a good textbook. Some things that we need to pay attention to. The vocabulary and grammar level should be appropriate for the level of the learners. Now, obviously, we've done a needs analysis to try to get at the level of the learners. Hopefully that would hold fairly true over most of the students that you would have in the course. The textbook should also focus on language and skills that are goals of the course. So if your goal is to teach reading, right, you should probably have a textbook that actually helps English language learners learn how to better read. Okay. I know that some of you are working on different projects, and obviously the skills that are important for those topics would then need to be the focus of your course or your textbook. Textbooks also should be below a certain price. Now, some students may receive their textbooks from the school. I know that that's the case in some public schools. However, if students are required to buy the book, it certainly needs to be well priced and affordable, whatever you consider that to be. The textbook should also be readily available. So don't choose some kind of book that would be an obscure text that you can't find easily. Of course, Amazon's made everything, and all, half-price books and all those websites have provided access to books in a way that, in the past was not available or were not easy to accomplish. However, if you somehow find a way to find a book that is not available on a site like Amazon, you've probably picked something a bit too obscure. It's also handy to make the book accessible to students immediately. If, for example, I know that at the Language Institute for UTRGV, they go ahead and pre-order all of the books that they'll be using in all of their classes. And when students arrive on the first day, they have them packaged, and the student actually pays the school for their package of textbooks. And so they don't have to go off looking for those textbooks. Another thing is that the size and number of lessons should suit the length of the course. So a way to think about this is look through the content. How long do you think it would take to cover all of that content? So one of the things, for example, that I've struggled with my own teaching of linguistics classes is a lot of the introductory linguistics texts have about 5 chapters that I really want to focus on for an entire semester, especially in a course like descriptive linguistics. But the textbook actually has like 12 chapters. So it's actually more content and information than I really want for this one course. I really just want to focus in. And actually, I'd love it if those chapters were each a little longer, right? The 5 that I actually want. So sometimes it can be a struggle to find a book that actually fits what you're looking for. If the textbook's really huge and you don't think you could get to all of it, again, you're going to have students a little frustrated that they had to pay all of that money. So you want to try to get a connection, right, between what you think you can actually cover and what the textbook is, basically. Okay. The last one is the textbook should not include behavior topics that would offend the religious or cultural sensitivities of the learners and their parents. Okay, I want to actually think about this one a little bit. So, first of all, I want to ask you the question, what do you think is most important out of this list for your students? But also, I want to focus on the last point a little bit. In what ways is that final point possible, and impossible. So I've got the little pause sign. If you want to stop here and take a moment to think about these, that would be great. Okay. Yeah, you could certainly pick almost any of these as being most important. You could make arguments for them. Of course, I think that the top two are quite important. So hopefully those were somewhere in your ranking of importance. They're just kind of high towards that. The last one I thought was a bit tricky, and I wanted to spend a bit of extra time on it because it's often hard to know exactly what would offend every group of people. So you could have a student from like the Middle East, a student from Africa, a student even from Mexico, and they would all have very different ideas about what's culturally appropriate. So there's first of all that, right? How dry do you have to make a textbook to make sure that no one would be offended? But then also there's a question, a debate about what is the nature of education. So is that really what we're trying to do, is shelter students from diversity of thought, diversity of behavior? So you can kind of take or leave that last one, maybe take it with a grain of salt, so that, this is not probably the be-all end-all of that discussion. There's more to think about there. Okay, your textbook, actually, and if you look at the table 11.2, which is actually in the previous page of the table that I pulled into the PowerPoint, has a list of different things that a textbook should theoretically have. So what you want to start thinking about is what is really important to you about the books that you're choosing for the class. And then you want to take the time to actually compare several books. So what table 11.3 then does is it takes a subsection of these important things that you could look for, these important features in a textbook. And then it gives a weight of how important you think each one of those things are. So for example here, interesting content is one of the most important items. Obviously useful language items is also very important. But they're saying here that avoidance of interference is not quite as important. Okay, it's a level 1. All right, and what they propose in this rubric to do then, actually if I can use my pointer here, is here they would provide a score out of 5. So maybe this textbook does really well in interesting content, 5, but maybe the language items aren't as useful, so maybe they get like a 3. What they're then doing would to try to get a final score for the textbook is taking the weight times the score. So for content, right, if it had a 5, then the weight times the 5 would be a 15. So it gets a 15 for content. If we continue down, right, for avoidance of interference, maybe it gets a score of 5 again. That's a lot. It has less weight though, so 1 times 5 would be 5. Okay. This allows you to get a total score that allows you to compare it to other textbooks. So you could have, for example, another column right here for another textbook, and be able to compare 2 textbooks in the same rubric. Okay. Obviously in 11.3 they've picked quite a few of the really big ones and shortened them down. You will actually be working on an assignment to choose some of the ones that you think are most important, and also begin to review textbooks. Okay, so let's say that you find a reasonably good textbook and you think it'll be useful. It's engaging. It has enough things that'll help a teacher get through the course. Students will probably be able to cover most of the content. So you've kind of gone through, yay, I found a good textbook. It's still probably not perfect. So let's look at some of the reasons that you might adapt a textbook. First, if the course book does not include all of the activities that a teacher has used successfully before, that suggests maybe it needs a little more, little help. If the course book does not fit comfortably in the timeline or the time available for the course, right? We talked about that one. If it contains unsuitable content, given either the proficiency or the age of the students. This could also go back to like the culturally appropriate content. If the course book lacks necessary skills or strategies that you think the learners really need. Or if perhaps the course book applies principles that the teacher does not feel comfortable with. So this would be a good point to definitely maybe check in with the teachers of the course, if you're not going to also be the teacher of the course, is as you start to adopt a textbook, does it need to be adapted to make sure that the teacher likes it? And also the course book may not involve learners in the curriculum design process. It probably doesn't, right, involve them. It's very hard to do that because at some point you have to put it down onto a page, a printed page, and that makes it very fixed, right? But because it doesn't, that might mean that you'd like to adapt it. Okay. So steps for adapting them. First, identify weaknesses. Some good questions to ask at this stage are, does the textbook reflect current theory or practice? In English language teaching, the field is pretty much satisfied currently, or moving towards even more the communicative language teaching approach. However, I think that as we've spent time, trying to teach students in the communicative language teaching approach, we've also noticed that it is useful to include methods and approaches and activities that allow students to focus on the language in ways that isn't always touted in the communicative language teaching philosophy, but it is useful to give them that time to focus on like language specific features. Does it give students plenty of chances to practice? So if it's just a book where students are reading, not checking their information, maybe not listening to things, all these different ways that students can practice their language skills, you need to make sure it has all of those, everything that you want as goals, that it has plenty of chances to practice those. Does it appeal to different types of learners? So here you could think of a few different things. Obviously, you could think of like visual, auditory, kinesthetic learners. You could also think of kind of intuitive versus analytic learners. So do they like to kind of follow their gut a little bit? Or do they like to have the rules presented and then practice applying those rules? Let's see, what else could you think of? You could think of people that like to work individually versus, working groups. So if it encourages, consistently working with a partner to do something, maybe some individual activities would be useful. Going on to the next one, does it encourage students to think critically? So not just accept everything, but gives them time to think about concepts and work through those concepts, hopefully in the language. And does it utilize local or otherwise interesting content? So if you're pulling content from like the last 30 years, 30 years ago, right? Maybe it's not as interesting as something that's a little more current. And probably the hardest one then would be utilizing local elements within a single textbook, right? It's easy to find local sources of information, perhaps even some local literature, but getting that in a more generalized textbook is challenging. Okay, so first you identify the weaknesses. Then you have to take steps to adapt. So some of your options: add or omit content. If you don't like something, you can chuck it. If you think it clearly needs, specific things added in to help students, you can go for it. Okay. You can always change the sequencing of the content. Obviously, textbooks are usually laid out so students can progress through the textbook from like page 1 to page 300. However, you're not stuck with that as the curriculum designer. So feel free to move things around, either chapters, in different orders, or material within chapters. You can also change the presentation. Here, if you kind of like something that they've tried to tackle in terms of the content, but the technique seems maybe a bit boring, or you really feel like it needs more communicative practice, changing the actual the presentation of that activity that they've included to be something more engaging or more useful for students. You can also add or omit certain types of monitoring, and that also goes along with add or omitting different types of assessment. A lot of textbooks have ways for students to kind of check to see if they're on track with their knowledge, or have like tests at the end of chapters. You don't have to use all of those things. Think about what's useful for your students. And I think this makes sense, right? You can change anything in a sense that you want, but this is keeping in an idea that, you know, even if you like an activity that the textbooks you introducing, you could change something as simple as the presentation of it. Okay, so sorry, let's go back. All right, so given that, right, what you need to think about as a curriculum designer is, what are you looking for in your textbook that you're going to choose for your class? And then how is that textbook still not perfect? Because pretty much no textbook is 100% perfect. So how would you adapt that textbook?